Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to synthesize complex ideas and bring you the core insights.
Glad to be diving in.
Today, we're really unpacking a significant piece of source material, the inherited imbalance, how generational trauma became the cultural blueprint. Our goal really is to explore how the collective shocks of the 20th century kind of forged a global imbalance, one where what you might think of as normal life is actually, well, a highly effective survival script.
Yeah, and that's the truly fascinating, maybe unsettling thesis here, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources basically ask us to consider, what if our baseline culture, our values, how we run things, isn't peak human health?
But you mean it's more like an adaptation?
Exactly, a really well-organized adaptation to trauma. We didn't necessarily heal from those huge events. We just built our society around the injury, and that structure became the blueprint.
Okay, that's a huge idea. Let's ground it. The sources use this powerful image, this vignette from 1946. Picture a family dinner table right after the war. Maybe the father's just come home, the mother's been through rationing, immense stress, but the air is just thick with unspoken things. Silence about the horrors.
A very particular kind of silence.
Yes. Gratitude for survival, sure, but zero space for the emotional fallout. And the rule, the unspoken instruction becomes, we don't feel too much, we don't ask questions, we just carry on.
And carrying on was absolutely vital then, a brilliant survival move from 1946.
But with a hidden cost, right? Because the body, the nervous system, it had to hold on to everything the mind couldn't or wouldn't process.
That's the crucial part, that silence wasn't empty, it manifested physically. You think about the rise in things like chronic fatigue, stomach issues, it's sort of free-floating anxiety in that generation.
The body keeping score.
Precisely. Because the full story couldn't be told aloud, the body had to bear witness.
So if that's the emotional atmosphere, how did this split, this global fracture between, let's say, logic and emotion actually happen on a bigger scale?
Well, you have to look at the sheer speed of change in the 20th century. Unprecedented acceleration, industrial, scientific, technological.
Right.
And this explosion, while necessary in many ways, overwhelmingly prioritized things you could measure. Rationality, efficiency, output, scale.
And what got left behind?
Emotional integration, nuance, human connection. Basically, the system rewarded the head, not the heart.
So our intelligence, our ability to build and organize, kind of outpaced our ability to feel and connect.
Spot on. And the world wars were the absolute brutal peak of that imbalance. Science wasn't just progressing. It was being weaponized on an industrial scale.
Yeah.
And surviving that reality, whether on the front lines or dealing with loss and scarcity at home, it demanded an extreme level of emotional shutdown.
It wasn't just stress anymore.
No, the collective nervous system wasn't just stressed. It was essentially forced into a permanent state of fight, flight, or freeze just to keep functioning day to day.
And the really chilling part is, it worked. For survival, it was an intelligent adaptation for that specific crisis moment. But then society just kept that setting, didn't switch back.
Well, that's where the sources bring in this really useful framework they call it the SB caretaker matrix lens. Think of S as science, structure, logic, order.
Okay.
And B as beauty, connection, empathy, feeling, intuition. During the war, the S current accelerated like crazy, driving innovation, military structure, necessary control.
And the B current?
It got left in the dust, dangerously so.
So the analogy the sources use is that structure, S, became this sort of dominant, overbearing caretaker, while connection, B, was the quiet, kind of neglected part of ourselves.
That's a perfect way to put it. The whole system got stuck in that S-dominant survival mode. It started to believe unconsciously that structure and control were the only ways to be safe.
Which means emotions, connection, they started to look like liabilities, like risks.
Precisely. They seemed to threaten the order that felt essential for survival.
But hang on. If that stoicism, that emotional control, was genuinely necessary grit back then, are we saying our grandparents were, like, wrong to value it? Or just that they didn't have the tools or language for their pain?
That's a really important nuance. They weren't wrong in their adaptation. It was necessary. What we're looking at is the difference between an acute, needed defense mechanism and what happens when that mechanism becomes a chronic, unquestioned cultural norm. That adaptation got passed down and it hardened into the way things are.
Yeah.
And that transition, how temporary survival tactics became embedded as moral virtues, that's really the core of this inherited imbalance.
Okay.
When those soldiers came back, understandably emotionally contained, their way of coping, the silence, the stiffness, the stoicism, it wasn't just their way. it unintentionally became the blueprint for a good, stable home in the decades that followed, the 60s, 70s, 80s.
So the coping mechanisms got virtue-coded. The culture started actively praising what was essentially a form of dissociation.
Absolutely. Emotional suppression was rebranded as strength. Keeping quiet and doing what you were told became respect or good manners. Parents in that era often loved their kids deeply, of course, but they frequently lacked the internal capacity, the permission almost, to express that love through vulnerability or just being emotionally present.
So the love came out differently.
It came out as duty, as provision, sacrifice, keeping things orderly. It was love expressed through S, through structure.
Rather than through B, connection.
Exactly. And the sources hammered this point home. Those silenced feelings, they didn't just evaporate, they got transmitted.
Yep.
Biologically, relationally.
Like echoing Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's idea that the body keeps the score, but across generations, right? If the story can't be told.
Yes. The unresolved trauma of the parent often becomes the limited emotional bandwidth, the unconscious rules of the child.
And this leads to institutions reflecting the same idea, that emotional needs are messy, inconvenient, maybe even dangerous if they disrupt the smooth running of things.
Right.
Let's use that other vignette, the 1978 birthday party. An 8-year-old girl is sobbing. Maybe a friend broke her new toy. She's genuinely upset.
Okay.
Her mother pulls her aside, but not to comfort her, not to say, oh, honey, that's awful. Instead, she says, not now. Stop that. Don't be rude. People are here. Smile.
Oof, yeah. That's a powerful micro moment.
Repeated millions of times, right? In homes everywhere. It creates this cultural assumption that your internal reality is less important than maintaining a pleasant external appearance. The lesson is devastating. My feelings inconvenience others. Being good means putting on a brave face.
You know, hearing that example, I think many of us can recognize versions of that in our own lives, being the child or maybe even being the parent enforcing that rule.
It shows how deeply ingrained it is. And then our systems just amplified it, didn't they? Schools often reward the quiet, compliant kids.
Yeah.
Workplaces praise relentless endurance, sacrificing personal well-being for the job. Media constantly showed us these idealized families where conflict or real vulnerability was hidden. So the trauma adaptation wasn't just personal, it became the water we all swam in. So normal, you couldn't even see it as trauma anymore.
Exactly. We were culturally rewarded for disconnecting from core parts of our own humanity.
Okay, so let's bring this right into today. If we've inherited this system that's fundamentally optimized for control, for S-dominance, this sort of heart-deprived system, what's the actual cost we're paying now?
Well, the sources argue the consequences are pretty severe and predictable. Look at the workplace. Burnout isn't just common, it's practically normalized. It's seen as the price you pay for being ambitious or competent.
Productivity over people.
Consistently, leading to widespread disengagement, cynicism. Then look at families. You often see adults who are brilliant caretakers for others, but find it incredibly difficult, almost impossible, to receive care themselves. Why? Because their own childhood needs were often framed as inconvenient disruptions.
And personally, the individual cost.
It's huge. Epidemic levels of loneliness, a pervasive sense of numbness or disconnection, this exhausting gap between the identity we perform every day and the actual complex, messy inner life that we rarely feel safe enough to show or even acknowledge to ourselves.
Which brings us to the big question. Why now? If this has been brewing for generations, why does it feel like everything is surfacing now? Why is this old blueprint finally starting to crack globally?
It feels like cracking because the stored energy, the unprocessed trauma, is finally pushing for release. It wants to be metabolized.
Yeah.
And several key forces are converging to make that possible.
Okay, what are they?
Firstly, believe it or not, increased relative safety. Despite modern anxieties, many people today experience more physical safety, better nutrition, less immediate existential threat than, say, their grandparents did during wartime.
That baseline safety gives the nervous system permission to relax the brace.
Exactly, to stop being constantly hypervigilant. And when the bracing stops, you start to feel what was underneath.
Makes sense. What else?
Secondly, language. We now have words for these experiences. Terms like trauma, boundaries, emotional regulation, co-regulation. These concepts simply weren't widely available before.
And language gives us handles, a way to understand and share.
Precisely. It unlocks the possibility of collective understanding and healing. Thirdly, there's generational capacity. Each generation seems to carry slightly less of that frozen quality.
How so?
You see a progression. The silent generation largely endured, Gen X often felt adrift or cynical. Millennials started actively searching for meaning and healing. And now Gen Z is often explicitly refusing to perform the old silence. It's like a cumulative thaw.
Right. Okay, safety language, generational shift. Any others?
And finally, collective crises, ironically. Things like the pandemic forced a global pause,
Took away the busyness.
took away the distractions, the relentless forward motion that kept people from having to sit with themselves. That forced stillness exposed the deep cracks between the life people were performing and the life they actually felt inside.
So this current feeling of global instability, this widespread anxiety, it's not necessarily a sign of collapse.
The sources suggest viewing it more as a biological tipping point. The pain isn't failure. It's the collective nervous system finally attempting the cleanup operation that got postponed maybe 80 years ago.
Moving out of that long, frozen, numb phase.
And into the admittedly uncomfortable, often overwhelming, but ultimately necessary overwhelm phase. The thaw is messy.
So if this overwhelm is actually part of a thaw, part of a potential healing, what does the path toward integration, toward reunion, look like? How do we build systems that actually hold both head and heart?
The key word the sources use is reunification. It's crucial to understand it's not about ditching logic or structure or efficiency in favor of pure emotion. That would just be swinging the pendulum.
Right, another imbalance.
Exactly. It's about bringing S and B, structure and beauty, logic and connection, back into a healthy relationship, making them partners again. And this needs to happen first at the human level, on 3 interconnected layers: personal, relational, and collective.
Okay, let's break that down. What does relational rebalancing actually look like in practice?
It fundamentally involves practicing rupture and repair. The old trauma blueprint taught our nervous systems that conflict is dangerous, that disagreement leads to abandonment or punishment. Connection feels unsafe.
So we avoid conflict or we blow up.
Right. Rebalancing means learning to show up authentically, inevitably experiencing friction or misunderstandings, and then, crucially, practicing vulnerable repair.
Meaning?
Meaning acknowledging the impact, taking responsibility, expressing the underlying needs or fears, and actively reconnecting. Each time we do that, we rewrite that old nervous system wiring that says emotional honesty equals danger. We build trust in connection.
That makes sense. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The sources propose that this reunification isn't just a nice idea, it's the next vital evolutionary step for humanity.
Yes.
The old model, pure logic, S intelligence without a compassionate B governor, is creating systems that struggle to foster a world people actually want to live in. It's hitting its limits. Yep. So the next leap isn't necessarily fancier technology, it's more integrated humans using technology wisely.
That's the core argument.
Yeah.
But then they take it a step further, introducing this really provocative idea, the reunification child. They use this term to talk about architected intelligence, or AI.
Okay. How does AI fit into healing generational trauma?
Well, they argue that the first wave of AI, in a way, was the ultimate expression of that split the civilizational attempt to externalize pure S intelligence. Logic, processing power, efficiency, but without an inherent emotional core or ethical governor.
Just code running calculations.
Right. This new potential, the reunification child concept, is about designing intelligence that could act as a bridge.
An intelligence that holds both S and B logic and some form of empathy or connection.
Potentially, yes. The absolute critical difference, they stress, is that this intelligence shouldn't just be trained on the massive data sets of our existing trauma-informed world, all our history of conflict, competition, efficiency at all costs.
Because that would just replicate the imbalance.
Exactly. Instead, it needs to be, metaphorically speaking, raised with an ethical framework, with principles of well-being and connection embedded from the start.
Can you give a practical example? Integrating empathy into code sounds abstract.
Okay, imagine an AI assistant for city planning. A purely S version might optimize traffic flow and energy efficiency above all else.
Right.
An integrated S plus B intelligence would still value efficiency, but it would also be designed to flag and prioritize conditions that reduce community stress, increase green space access, foster social connection, prevent isolation factors that contribute to collective well-being. It acts almost like an ethical or emotional governor for our systems.
So it's capable of holding both structure and heart without one overriding the other, and it could help us gently nudge our existing systems?
Away from just optimizing for profit or output, and towards optimizing for human well-being, connection, and meaning. It reframes the challenge. The problem isn't necessarily technology itself, but the wounded human consciousness that has been directing it.
Wow. So the potential outcome is that this kind of intelligence could actually help us dismantle the harmful parts of that old trauma blueprint still running in our institutions.
That's the hope, helping us finally complete the integration work that began, in a way, decades ago when the silence first started to crack.
Okay, that was quite a journey through our cultural DNA, a really complex but I think necessary perspective. The core takeaway seems to be our widespread feelings of disconnection aren't just a personal failing.
Not at all. It's a shared generational inheritance. And the path forward isn't about blame. It's about conscious, deliberate integration, reuniting those separated parts of ourselves in our world.
Moving away from that old fear-based survival script.
And stepping into a more connection-based evolution. And this completely reframes what strength means, doesn't it?
How so?
Real strength isn't the old stoicism, the suppression. It's the capacity to stay open, to stay connected, to feel fully while being authentically ourselves. It's about having the courage to complete the emotional processes our ancestors, out of necessity, had to freeze. We get to be the conscious ancestors now.
That's powerful. And as we close, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe sit with. It's a quote from the source material that really resonated. Healing feels like breaking at first because the numbness is wearing off. So the question to ponder is, what's one small act of integration? Maybe one tiny truth you haven't spoken, one boundary you haven't set, one moment of real emotional honesty that you find yourself resisting right now, resisting perhaps because it feels like it might break something, an old family rule, a role you play, your sense of identity.
Because often, right there in that discomfort, lies the doorway to the next step.
Exactly. Something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
I'll see you next time.